Good afternoon. My name is Mark Fink, and I'm the community librarian for the Cupertino Library, which is part of the Santa Clara County Library District. I'd like to thank all of you for coming out this afternoon, and we're looking forward to a really informative panel discussion. Before we get started, I would just like to thank the organizations that made today possible. First is the Cupertino Library Foundation, the Cupertino Historical Society, the Santa Clara County Library District and the Cupertino Library, the Friends of the Cupertino Library. Special thanks to the Japanese American Museum of San Jose and also to the California History Center at De Anza College. This panel discussion will be filmed. That's why we have the cameras here. So we also want to thank the City of Cupertino for their generosity and their time in filming today's event. Also, I just want to point out that kind of the format for the event today, we're going to have a moderator, and we'll have some panelists, and they'll share their thoughts. And then at the end of our session, we'll have an opportunity for you to ask some questions. We have a microphone that's set up over here, so at the end of the presentations, and if you have some questions that you'd like to ask, we ask that you queue up right by the microphone. And Tom will let you know when that time is upon us. So with that, I'd like to introduce the moderator for today's event. Mr. Tom Izu is the Executive Director of the California History Center, and he's also the Project Director for Impact AAPI. It's the Asian American and Native American Pacific Islander Serving Institutions, which is being funded with a grant from the United States Department of Education. So with that, I'd like to welcome Tom to the podium.
Thank you, Mark. I wish to express my gratitude to the Cupertino Library and the Cupertino Library Foundation for hosting educational events like this. I really think this is what libraries are all about, being the focal point for our local community in its effort to keep wisdom and humanity intact. Before we get into the theme today, which is what can we learn from the Japanese-American internment during World War II, I wanted to give you a little bit more background because some of you may not have come to our first panel, which actually dealt more about Japanese-American history, and that was back in September. And some of you may not remember what was said, including myself. So I just want to start with some of looking back a little bit. Many of you know that over 70 years ago, Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor led the United States into World War II. With that, Japanese Americans, people of Japanese ancestry on the West Coast, their loyalty was severely questioned. People like my parents, who were born here in the U.S., were seen as the enemy because they had Japanese names, because they looked Japanese, and they had parents who immigrated from Japan. Years of persecution and scapegoating also made it very easy for people like my parents and their parents to be targeted as potential fifth columnists. In those days, that's what we now call terrorists, who could at any time strike back for the Empire of Japan. And they were, as people in the time were saying, were totally and unequivocally incapable of ever being Americans due to their race, their creed, their culture, and spiritual beliefs. Many of you might not know, however, that Japanese Americans had been under surveillance by various agencies of the United States government years before the attack on Pearl Harbor, going through the 1930s and probably even before that. And these military intelligence and other agencies made it very clear once they studied Japanese Americans, including informants they had within the Japanese American communities as sources, that Japanese Americans were categorically not a threat to the national security of the U.S. and were in fact, and I quote directly from the words of one of the authors of these government reports, were, in quotes, pathetically loyal, unquote. So even J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI at the time, who has never been known as a great proponent of civil rights and civil liberties, he also agreed with these reports and felt Japanese Americans were not a security threat. Regardless of this, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942, ultimately leading to the forced removal of all Japanese Americans from the West Coast and their imprisonment in concentration camps throughout the United States. Many of them remained there for the entire war period. To this day, it is considered to be one of the most massive violations of our Constitution and the civil liberties that are promised us under the laws of this land. Even though people like my parents, 2/3 of the Japanese Americans at the time were U.S. citizens, and even though it was totally carried out without due process of law, it still happened. And just so you understand, no Japanese American was ever convicted of espionage or doing any kinds of acts against the United States government. So why did this happen? A federal commission established by an act of Congress in 1983 released a report after doing hearings, interviews, and studies, and they agreed that a wrong was committed by the United States government to its own citizens. And they said the internment was caused by 3 things: racial prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. After many years of advocacy work done by Japanese Americans and their supporters, the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 was signed by President Reagan on August 1988. And this echoed the finding of the commission that a wrong was committed and desperately needed to be redressed for the sake of this country. Not just Japanese Americans, but for everybody in this country. And it involved monetary compensation to Japanese Americans as a form of redress for all the losses they suffered, including their freedom. Official letter of apology signed by the president, whoever the president of the United States was at the time the letter went out, to go to each Japanese American affected by the internment. And an educational fund was established to help ensure the public learned about what happened during World War II to Japanese Americans, with the idea that this doesn't happen again to anybody in this country. So now, back to the present in our panel here. The question this afternoon: what can we learn from the World War II internment of Japanese Americans? Is it relevant to current issues today? Do we even need to talk about it anymore, since the government did admit it was wrong, since the government did pay reparations? What's the point? They've already done some educational work through this fund. But I'm not going to go into this long. I think we can talk about this when we have our discussion. But since 9/11 and the unleashing of the war on terror, I think all are aware that there have been many attacks against various groups of people, especially Muslim Americans or anybody who people think look Arab or Middle Eastern, however they define that. And disturbingly, there have also been efforts on the part of our own government to move to be able to imprison anybody, including U.S. citizens, without due process, basically. An extrajudicial means, in other words. So is there a way to use what Japanese Americans went through and all these different things that we know now from this history? Is there a way to help us understand when these issues come up, when these things come up in the news you hear about? Maybe it makes you afraid. Maybe it makes you wonder if we should, in fact, imprison people. Maybe it's okay to do that. Is there something we can learn from the experience of Japanese Americans that will help us have a deeper understanding of this and maybe act differently than what happened to my parents and grandparents? So this panel today, we have some very special guests here. They're going to share with you the experiences of their own organizations. They're all involved in educational organizations of various kinds. And I'm hoping after each talks to leave some time for questions and comments, as Mark said. I'm going to introduce each of them right now. First, I have Ling Wu Liu right here, and she's the director of the Korematsu Institute in San Francisco. The Korematsu Institute, I believe, is a project of the Asian Law Caucus. Ling is a journalist by training. She's worked in Asia for Time Magazine, and she was also a television reporter for CCTV in Hong Kong. She's also a filmmaker. She directed a film called Officer Tsukamoto, a documentary film about an unsolved murder of a Japanese-American police officer in 1970. So she's very well versed in media. And now she's the director of the Korematsu Institute and was the first director of that institute beginning in February 2010. Right next to her is Steve Doi, San Jose State University Asian American Studies. Steve Doi has taught Asian American Studies for, I think, over 25 years now. 20 what? More?
32.
32. Oh, my goodness. This is old. Sorry. I was trying to help you out, Steve.
Thanks.
He's taught classes on Japanese American history and on the Japanase American internment. He is a lawyer by training, and he's also an avid collector and a real top-notch archivist himself. He collects rare books and documents about Asian American history. And last but not least is Jimi Yamaichi. Jimi is the director of the Japanese American Museum of San Jose and its curator. Jimi has been a leader in the Japanese American community in this area since before I was a sentient being. There are just too many achievements this man has accomplished to fit into an introduction. In fact, there have been entire programs, longer in this one we're doing today, just about Jimi and what he's done for us. Suffice to say that Jimi is a former internee of the Tule Lake Internment Camp near the California-Oregon border and continues to lead pilgrimages up there every 2 years with the Tule Lake Committee. He is a master woodworker by training, and you can see his handiwork in the replicas of internment camp, barracks, and other things he's done for various museums in the area, including at the Japanese American Museum of San Jose. As the director and curator of the museum, he continues to advocate for remembering and learning from the experiences of Japanese Americans. Now, before I have the panelists talk about their organizations, I thought it would help us get things going by showing a very short video produced by the Korematsu Institution. And I think I'm just supposed to tell you to go ahead and roll it, and you'll do it, right? So go ahead.
Very nice, right on your heart.
Korematsu, we stand up for what is right.
At Fred T. Korematsu Discovery Academy in East Oakland, kids start the day with a pledge that emphasizes morality and courage.
We chose the name Fred Korematsu because we really felt like the attributes that he showed in his work are things that the children need to learn, is that common people can stand up and make differences in a large number of people's lives.
In 1942, an ordinary American took an extraordinary stand. Fred Korematsu boldly opposed the forced internment of Japanese Americans during World War II.
The children, they relate very strongly to Mr. Korematsu. A lot of our population is, including me, we are immigrants, and I asked them, are you Mexican American or are you American? Half of them were like, we're American. And when they relate it to their lives, they see how unfair something like that can be.
It was December 7th, it was Sunday. And Sunday morning, gosh, it must have been about 10 o'clock. My girlfriend and I were up on Skyline Boulevard, looking down the Bay Area of the city and so forth. Just relaxing, had the music on, the car radio, and all of a sudden it stopped. And they announced that Pearl Harbor was attacked by Japanese airplanes. And I just couldn't believe it.
The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 took the lives of over 2,400 people and catapulted the U.S. into World War II. It also drastically changed the lives of more than 100,000 Japanese Americans.
It made it twice as hard to live here decently and to prove that you're more American than Japanese.
Fred tried to enlist in the U.S. National Guard and Coast Guard, but was denied enlistment because of his race. Japanese Americans living in the U.S. were now perceived as a threat. In February of 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, forcing them into prison camps across the West Coast.
It just burned me up that this happened, and I was still determined to prove that I'm an American. After the evacuation notices were posted on the telephone poles, I decided to go ahead and go back to work.
Fred protested the Japanese American incarceration by ignoring the order, an act of resistance that put him in violation of the law and led to his arrest.
The judge said that I violated the military order. There was 4 MPs standing there, and they would start pulling out the guns. They said, we have orders from my commanding officer that he is not going to take a step outside this door.
Fred was forced into the Topaz incarceration camp in Utah with the rest of his family.
I didn't have any luggage or anything. It was just whatever I had on my back. There's no floor, it's just dirt. So the wind was blowing through there, and there's cracks all around the walls. And there's a light bulb up there, one light bulb, and on the ceiling, and also an iron cot with straw, and that was it. I felt like a prisoner, prisoner of war.
While still in the prison camp, Fred challenged and appealed every ruling on his case until it was finally heard by the United States Supreme Court.
We lost in the Supreme Court, and I just couldn't believe it. It just seemed that the bottom dropped out.
After his release from the camp in 1944, Fred got married, started a family, and built a career as an industrial draftsman. But he was often reminded of his criminal record.
Having this record given by the government, I just can't feel that I am a truly American because of this. And that was back in my mind all these years.
In 1983, aided by a team of civil rights attorneys, he challenged the legality of his 1944 Supreme Court case.
I wasn't afraid to speak up. It was unconstitutional what they did to the Japanese American, putting them in concentration camps. The judge, she said that the government should think twice before they do anything like this again. I just couldn't believe that this happened, but I won, and so did everybody else that was there. There were a lot of them with, tears in their eyes because they were in turn also. It was a great victory for all Americans and all Asians in this country that this will never happen again.
Fred and his team had proven that the United States government had no grounds to incarcerate Japanese Americans.
In the long history of our country's constant search for justice, some names of ordinary citizens stand for millions of souls. Plessy, Brown, Parks. To that distinguished list, today we add the name of Fred Korematsu.
Okay, now we're going to proceed with our panel. And I have Ling here, who's going to talk about her work in the Korematsu Institute.
All right. Well, again, thank you, Tom, for having me on the panel. As he mentioned, I'm the director of the Fred Korematsu Institute for Civil Rights and Education, which is a program of the Asian Law Caucus in San Francisco. The Asian Law Caucus has been around for about 40 years in the Bay Area. It is the first legal civil rights organization serving Asian Americans in the country. And what's wonderful is that the caucus is now part of a much larger national affiliation of Asian American civil rights groups. The whole idea being that we want to have a stronger voice when it comes to national issues, stronger voice when it comes to bringing issues to the table in Washington, D.C. and so forth. The Korematsu Institute is slightly different from the other programs at the caucus that are more legal focused. We focus on education, and the main program being our work in K through 12 classrooms. We develop, I couldn't resist, we develop and we distribute free Korematsu teaching kits to any teacher in the country who requests one. You can go on to our website, which is korematsuinstitute.org, and request a free teaching kit. And in a matter of weeks, we'll have one to you in your mailbox. The teaching kits consist of a teaching guide that's about 100 pages that has lesson plans for K through 12 teachers, multiple videos on DVDs, including the video that you just saw, and additional books as well. What's wonderful, actually, I say that these are available to any teacher in the country, but just a few days ago, we received our first international order, which was really exciting. Every once in a while, we go through our requests just to see who these teachers are who are requesting these materials from us. And, at the beginning, I think we all assumed that a lot of the teachers would be coming from places where there are a lot of Asian Americans, or places that I think we might associate with, more progressive education. San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, places like that. But honestly, every time I look at our list, I'm constantly surprised because we see a lot of teachers who are requesting kits from Arkansas, from Nebraska, from a range of different states. But this new request came in from Colombo, Sri Lanka. And all it said in the request at the end of the form, it said, we asked, how did you hear about us? And the teacher just said, I searched for something like this on the internet, which I thought was really, really inspiring. And hopefully that is the beginning of a larger outreach effort on our part to really, I think, take the story of Fred Korematsu, which helps, I think, to kind of personalize the story of the Japanese-American internment, and really message it as a story of human rights, which I think transcends any kind of national border. So you all saw a bit about Fred Korematsu's story, so I don't think I need to give an overview about what he does. But beyond the curriculum program that we work on, we also do a lot of community outreach through a window that we call Fred Korematsu Day. And actually, back in 2010, we were able to work with a host of community organizations to encourage and eventually successfully encourage the California legislature to pass a bill named after Fred Korematsu. So that passed. We now have this day in perpetuity, which is wonderful. And it's every January 30th, which is on Fred Korematsu's birthday. It's very interesting because there are a whole lot of civil rights heroes' birthdays clustered together. Dr. King's Day is in mid-January. So it falls on that Monday. And then Fred Korematsu Day is January 30th, and then you kind of turn around the corner and Rosa Parks Day falls on February 4th, and before long is Cesar Chavez Day on March 31st. So the beginning, I guess, late winter, early spring is a very special, very busy time, at least in our calendar. So Fred Korematsu Day passes, and we were very, very excited because it was the first day in U.S. history named after an Asian American, which I sometimes can't believe that we say that because Asian Americans have been in this country for so very long. And it took that long for something like this to pass. But for multiple reasons, I think Fred Korematsu's story has really resonated in a different way since his passing in 2005. So the day passed, and we were all very excited, but it passed. And beyond that, I think what's far more important than just getting the legislative bill through is what do you do with it? I felt that we had a huge opportunity to make something of the day. And, it's like having a place. It's like having the Japanese American Museum of San Jose. Having a place is such a wonderful way to bring the community together. But also kind of having this time of year, January 30th, and the days and the weeks surrounding it, is a really special opportunity for us to work with perhaps libraries like this one, or to work with classrooms, or to work with student groups and whatnot. So we are now entering into our third Fred Korematsu Day season. It's become so busy that I now call it a season. And what's wonderful is this past season, we actually, I think we counted, there were about 25 events across 5 states. So it was really, really beautiful to see this small movement grow so quickly, because it didn't matter that Rhode Island didn't have an official Fred Korematsu Day. These students went ahead and had a celebration anyway. And then a few months ago, we got word that the governor of Hawaii has recognized Fred Korematsu Day in the state of Hawaii for this coming January 30th. And again, it's not so much about the day, but it's about the educational opportunities. I think that if you look at all of the details of this terrible civil rights violation that happened, the way I see it, it happened to all of us. It happened to all Americans, because it really, some people may be surprised that I, as a Chinese American, work on this type of program, but for me it's personal, because I think the story of Fred Korematsu, the story of 120,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry, is something that should affect all of us, and we should take it personally, I believe. So if you look at, I think, the full story of what happened, it's quite complicated. As Tom said, the Japanese American community had been surveilled for decades beforehand. There were a lot of different interests at hand that were pro-internment for economic reasons, for political reasons, and whatnot. But I think to try to translate that into a history that a 5-year-old can understand, some people say, oh, well, it's so complicated. Fred Korematsu's story is something that's taught to lawyers, and, there was his first case in 1942, and there was a second case where it was reopened, and let's not even get into coram nobis, which is the legal means by which Fred Korematsu's case was reopened. But the way I see it is that if students can learn the story of Martin Luther King, or if they can learn the story of Rosa Parks, that was a very complicated Supreme Court case about integration on the public buses in Alabama. You can really boil any of these stories down to something that a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old can understand. Rosa Parks did not want to give up her seat because she didn't think she had to. And Fred Korematsu did not want to leave his home. He also didn't want to leave a girlfriend. He had a girlfriend, you know. And I think what's interesting is that you can boil his story down to something that's just so human. He was just a young, 23 years old, which is always shocking to me, a young man who said, this isn't fair. And as an American, I'm not going to go. And he did everything he possibly could to avoid the camps. Ultimately, it didn't work for reasons that we actually still don't understand. But someone clearly ratted him out. You don't see it in the film that we just showed, but he was supposed to meet his girlfriend on the street corner in San Leandro one day, and instead of his girlfriend, two MPs showed up and arrested him. So clearly, I think someone was watching his whereabouts. But again, as I say, I think all of these very complicated histories can be boiled down in a very simple way that students can understand and that students can carry with them, hopefully, as they grow into adults, so that something like this never happens again. So I don't want to say too much more and take up all this time, but thank you again, Tom.
Thank you very much. And next, we're going to hear from Steve Doi, San Jose State Asian American Studies.
All right. Thank you for having me today. Pleasure to be here with Ling and Jimmy. Usually I'm in the audience when Jimmy's talking all the time, so great to be here on stage with you. Tom asked me to talk a little bit about how we incorporate internment in the U.S. history class at San Jose State University. I teach the General Ed Lower Division, U.S. History and Politics, and the first semester we go through the Constitution up to the Civil War, and the second semester in the spring we hit World War II and the internment. So with that, we have a lot of solid background about the creation of the Constitution. We have a lot of past study of the Civil War and the Civil War amendments and the failure of Reconstruction in the Supreme Court during that time. So by the time we get to World War II, we've already seen a pattern of failure by government, by politicians, and by the Supreme Court. So we go through the facts and dates pretty thoroughly about the camp experience. And then when we come to contemporary culture and we hit 9/11, then that gives us a chance to relook at World War II and see what patterns arise there. And with that, what we try to emphasize is, for one, the public can't count on the Supreme Court at all. So even though it's an important institution that, you can't wait till it gets to the Supreme Court. And especially this election year, I emphasize that the president is the one that nominates Supreme Court justices. So no matter which way you feel, you have to voice your opinion during that time, because ultimately it affects the Supreme Court, and ultimately the Supreme Court will affect everybody. But when we look at 9/11 and the internment, I also try to emphasize that it's the failure of the public and politicians too, because the politicians are just egged on by public opinion, whether it's bad or good. And in modern times with 9/11, that everyone can voice their opinion about what should happen and not let it go too far, not let the politicians, and not let your fellow citizens who may have strange ideas of what's right and wrong, to talk with them and to educate them too. So it's up to everybody, every student, to know of the facts and to know of the history, and don't just let politicians and blame them. Don't let the Supreme Court do something and blame them, but it's up to everybody from the grassroots onward, from students, and especially emphasize to students that when you're a college student, even though at San Jose State many of them have to work full-time and part-time, when you're a student, that's one of the best times and opportunities to get involved civically, because once you get a job, once you have a family, you just can't sacrifice as much time for these causes and stuff. But no matter what it is, as when you're a student, that you should use that time and do things that you might normally not do, and that's the whole university experience. So we keep on pressing students to get involved no matter what the issue is. Also, I was thinking about the topic, and my classes, there's no longer a great number of Japanese American students there. all different Asian American students, a lot of Middle Eastern students. And for Middle Eastern students, there's always a handful of really active and articulate students that will raise their hands and challenge me on a lot of stuff, and that's great. But also, there's many Middle Eastern students that sit in the back, especially some of the females sometimes, that won't say anything, won't do anything. And I think it's important for them in the class to show that other people will stand up for you and stuff, and that they're not alone. So even though they don't say anything, that doesn't mean they're not thinking. That doesn't mean that they're complacent. And I think it takes some examples of people standing up to have an effect on them. And I think they really appreciate that. And like I said, there's a number of students that are outspoken anyway, but for some of the students to show an example of people standing up in times of need is a good lesson for everybody. So,
thank you, Steve.
That's all I have to say.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next, we have Jimi Yamaichi from the Japanese American Museum in San Jose.
Thank you, Tom. Thank the panelists here. I'll kind of fill in some holes that Steve just talked about. Civil rights. I won't talk about my part of it. A lot of it is my part of it too. Like the Army was segregated in the World War II, and they had a hard time, right? Because there was a black army group, a Spanish army group, the all American army, and there was a Japanese American army group too, of soldiers that was drafted, a lot of them volunteered, and the quality of them, like my brother was in the army before the war, and he was in the Camp Roberts there, and was transferred into Midwest, Kansas, Camp Raleigh. And when they arrived there's a whole group of Japanese American soldiers, and they took the guns away from them. Now, like Bob said there, he's a soldier there, he's standing with a real gun, and I'm standing there alongside him with a wooden gun. How would you feel? Equality, like he says, equality, civil rights. That's how it was. They had to train with wooden guns. You're training with real rifles. They don't know what a bullet is. Type of deal. Well, anyway, make a long story short, in World War II, they were, talk about the casualty rate. What is the casualty rate of the World War II? The regular American Army, there was approximately, casualty was 5.8%. 5.8% casualty in World War II, over the number of soldiers. Japanese American casualty, there was a small group of them, and they were 28.5%. So if you read the history books, the tough job they got, saving the lost battalion, climbing the Gothic wall, and bars, all the different areas that were pushed into some, I think that should have been civil rights. Now come back to civil rights into the camp area. Okay, they were drafting people out of camp. We were behind barbed wire fence. We had soldiers around guarding us, especially Tui Lake. There were 1,200 soldiers guarding us, 28 guard towers, searchlights and stuff, whole thing. And I was one of them that got called to be drafted in the Army. Plus, meantime, Hard Mountain, Minidoka, Colorado, Utah, all of them were being asked to be drafted into the Army. Now, you're behind barbed wire fence. You're not free to move. You cannot walk out of the gate with that guy with a gun in your face. Would you join the Army? But a lot of them did join the Army. But I was one of the 27 in the Tui Lake that resisted. We decided not to go. So I got my orders in March of 1944, and in July of 1944, the federal court opened session in Eureka every summertime. And we were being tried for draft evasion. Make a long story short, we went through a lot of process and this and that. We had the Judge Goodman from San Francisco preside on the court bench and asked us, what kind of condition you're living under? I said, well, we got guards all around us and such, not free to move. When we go outside, we have army guards with us on the trucks all the time. You cannot leave. The camp itself had 37 miles of wire fence around us, and the moment barbed wire, there was almost 100 miles of barbed wire stretched around us. Now, if you people were in that condition, would you volunteer or would you go be drafted? But after several weeks of dissertation and discussion at the court, the judge felt that we were not given due process to the law. The Selective Service Act says only free Americans shall be drafted into the the U.S. Army. Would you classify us as free agents? No, our judge says, no, you're not a free agent. You're under confinement just like being in penitentiary, along with all our brothers and sisters and mothers, whoever else. So he exonerated us. We were free to go back to the camp. But Heart Mountain, Minidoka, Colorado, and all the rest of them, they read in the same law. They said, you broke the law, you're a draft evader, you go spend 3 years in federal penitentiary, which they did. Now, that's civil rights. It's hard to say. Like Steve said, student class asked me, why didn't you go? I mean, first of all, we went to camp, we were already disclassified as non-citizen, we're non-alien. And then when we were all in camp, they reclassified us from 1A to 4C, enemy alien. For 1 whole year, we were 4C. Then they want us back in the Army again, they reclassified us 1A. So that's a civil rights issue. But anyway, I'd like to tell my personal story, civil rights. I went to trade school in San Jose and graduated from San Jose High School, San Jose Technical High School in 1941. I went to the Union Hall to get my union card, and we don't let people like you into our union. So, you're just out of high school, young kid, you're kind of scared, like a dog with 15 legs run out of the place. But 4 years later, after I came back from camp, I went back again. 4 years older, 4 years smarter, a little bit more, abrasive. And I walked to the Union Hall, the same business agent was there, and they just told me in so many good words, just to get out of there. We don't let you in. But could I go into the civil rights? Could I go into court and find out whether I'm allowed to join a union or not? Because any other organization that was on the country, the Elks, the Masons, or whatever it may be, we were not allowed to go into their hall at all. But persistence, I went back by myself. One-man show, I fought them. Every 2 weeks I will go back. Finally, in mid-August, they said, Jim, okay, you get a job with a union shop, we'll give you a card, which I did. So on August the 17th, I walked to the job site there and asked for a job. The guy said, sure, come on. Where's your tools? In my car. So I got my tools out, went to work, and the union agent followed me and says, Jim, son of a gun, you got a job, haven't you? We'll give you a card. So that opened it up. So like a lot of it, you had to fight the issue head on by yourself, not with a big gang of guys to wave a flag. I think they have to understand you that I was capable of doing the job. I'm not afraid of anybody. I can fight you just as well as you can fight me. So I think, like Steve said, the civil rights got to be. You have the experience of fighting them. You stay alongside and fighting them. So I'll just leave it at that and go on Steve.
Okay, thank you, Jimmy. What I'd like to do is ask each of the panelists a few questions. And if you have your own questions when I'm done, then please, the microphone will be here and you can ask away. The first question I have for Jimmy. After 9/11, there were a lot of discussions. Discussions is a nice way to say it, but things about Arab Americans, Middle Eastern people, however people thought they were, who they thought they were, Muslims in particular. One thing I know, it's documented on film, Jimmy, is that you went to some programs supporting Muslim Americans. In fact, I remember seeing you in a film that was very local. It was Santa Clara, a mosque in Santa Clara, and you were there with other Japanese Americans. So I thought maybe you can share with us why you did that. As a Japanese American, why did you think it was important to show support for the Muslim Americans right here in our community right after 9/11? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I'm sorry, Tom. I'm hard of hearing, so I didn't get the first part of it. But
yeah, it was just you can share why you supported Muslim Americans after 9/11 when Muslim Americans
Muslim
yes,
people. Yes, I think at the time when the war broke out, I was kind of involved with it. They call themselves no-says. I'm a Nisei, this sounds it, but they're no-says. They come from mixed family. And they were banding together. There were a bunch of from San Francisco State University in Berkeley, and they were trying to get together and help the other people like their problems are. Being mixed marriage family, they had a lot of problems. And they asked me to be an advisor to them. So at the time I was an advisor. And then December 7th come along and said, let's have a rally and support the Muslim people. We're fighting a battle, they're fighting a battle on the front line. So they finally got permission to have a rally in San Francisco Peace Plaza. And at the time they asked many people to speak up for them. It was kind of scary. This says, Jim, could you speak? I said, sure, I'll speak. I mean, I'm not afraid of them. So we had a big rally in San Francisco, the first organized rally. And we went on in San Francisco, spoke up for them. From then on, we went on to different groups, went to their temple or whatever in Santa Clara. They have a huge place there. And we supported them many, many times. And through their efforts there, they had a big banquet one day, and they invited me. There was, 1,000 people there. And I didn't know. Just, well, you're coming. Come to the banquet, they give me a plaque, a peace plaque, for supporting the group. It makes you feel good that the little we did, because the no-say group, they went out there, really banged the doors, really went out and talked to different people. They said, we're discriminated, they're discriminated because what they do, what they are, that's all it is. They had nothing wrong with it. Like Hirabayashi that was fighting a case with Korematsu, he made a statement there. Hirabayashi made a statement. Hirabayashi said, as I said, the only charge against him was his ancestry. It would have been able to defend, I'm sorry, if I had been charged with espionage or some crime, he would have been able to defend himself. So he couldn't defend himself because of his ancestry. Same thing as where you come from. So that was this issue. So that was kind of interesting.
Thank you, Jimmy. The next question I have, and actually you can all add in if you want anytime, but I think I'll direct it at Steve. You actually brought this up. I think it's very important, and maybe you can all think of questions related to this, but I think my experience in education is that students know they have rights in this country, or they're learning about it. And we know, people in education know you should teach them that you have rights. Know what your rights are. You should stand up for your rights. And I get that feeling that in the general population, people understand that, hey, you can't do that. I'm an American. I have rights. But the big question, and you touched on this a little bit, and I thought maybe you can expand on it, is that I'm not sure if people understand that it's your obligation and your duty to stand up for other people's rights. That's how it works. It's not like you just have rights and everything else is fine. If somebody else's rights are being taken away, you have to stand up for that person and their rights. That's kind of an obligation in how this system works. If you don't, then there's really no reason to have a constitution when it comes down to it. Because people have mentioned that to me. They said, well, at certain times, they didn't use the word inconvenient, but same thing, that things are bad, sorry, you just can't talk about that. But then what's the point of having these laws or rights, or anybody having any individual rights? So in education, and when you're talking to students and other people, how do you deal with that one?
Well, I think in my classes, I try to put across a feeling that historically, the minority's always been the minority, and as a minority, they don't have enough clout to do anything. So it really takes other people to move forward and be affirmative in protecting other people's rights. And I think when you look at history, that repeats itself all the time. And I try to put that feeling across to the students, but on the other hand, I feel really troubled sometimes because one of my best Middle Eastern students went back to one of the Middle Eastern countries during the revolt, during the Arab Spring, and then right in the middle of it, she emailed me, things are going great against the regime. And then I said, please don't write, we'll talk later. And I never heard of her again, from her again. So I think, I still put forth that effort to try to get students involved in everything, but still at one point, there's a point where you don't want them to get their picks and shovels and march down the street and stuff too. So I think in my classes, you just have to show the patterns of history and that people have stood up for other people, and the Quakers for the Japanese during the war, many examples of individuals, and we find those and try to bring them out. But on the other hand, I feel it's a misuse of power for me to be in front of the students to say, let's go and do this and do that. So it's a fine line that you have to kind of always draw there between involvement and having the students think for themselves and doing what they feel is appropriate and what they have the ability and can do. Mm-hmm. But that's why I keep on saying when you're a student, you have more ability to do things. And especially, I tell them, even in class, raise your hand and tell me that I'm full of baloney. Because the worst that could happen is I could go, too bad. But you get experience in challenging authority because once you do it in your workplace or someplace else, you don't have that freedom to do that because of your livelihood or anything. But in college, that's when you should really challenge and look for your limits and everything. And I try to push that view, but I'm always tempered by the one student that went back and emailed me and never heard from again.
And the next question I have is for Ling. You already started talking about, you guys just started talking about all the things I wanted to bring up anyway, but one of them was about the universal nature of this lesson that Japanese Americans have. One thing that I'm very concerned about as I get older is Japanese Americans, we're a very small population in terms of ethnic groups in the United States. So does it mean that when we're gone, and we get smaller and smaller, does this whole story disappear too? Is there only value in it while we're around, and because I'm a Japanese American, I can talk to people about it? Or is there something about it that is universal, as you said, is an American story? And that gave me a lot of hope, watching some of the things from the Korematsu Institute, like the film we had, seeing these little kids who obviously aren't Japanese American, and they can see something, a lesson in what Fred did, and what the Japanese American story is. It's not just about, I think Japanese Americans are really interesting. That's not what they're talking about. They're talking about a lesson they learned from studying our history. So I was wondering if you can say a little bit more about that, the response that you see getting from people outside Japanese American community, and the future of that, what you can see the Korematsu Institute working on in that way.
Well, thanks for that question. Yes, I think the scene that you're referring to, it comes from the Korematsu Discovery Academy, which is an elementary school in East Oakland, California. The students are primarily African American and Latino American, and the chant, the kind of mantra that they recite every Monday morning when they all get on the blacktop for their assembly is Korematsu, we stand up for what is right, which is exactly the message that we're trying to impart to them, is not just speaking out for yourself, but speaking out for what is right. And that could be what is right for the student sitting next to you. It could be what is right for your neighbor or your relatives or anything. It doesn't have to specifically refer to the Japanese American incarceration, but it can be anything that they see that's unfair. But I think your question about what happens to this story as the percentage of Japanese Americans dwindles in this country compared to the general population is an interesting one. But I think the onus is really on all of us who are engaged in education, just to make sure that this story and so many other stories of American history that have been ignored for so long, to make sure that they stay alive in the classroom. And I think that the history of Asian Americans has really not been incorporated, for the most part, in any part of the country, whether it's the public or private school system. And again, Asian Americans have been in this country for so long, so it's not like we're asking for any special favors. We're asking for American history to be taught accurately. And I think until we do that, it is not surprising that such a large part of the American community doesn't think of us as Americans, doesn't think of us as people who belong. We're kind of constantly outsiders, constantly recent immigrants, and that is the case for many who are recent immigrants in our community. But I think what's being lost here is kind of the nuances of the different generations that have been here. Some are very new, some have been here for centuries, literally. I also think that there are important educational opportunities for not just young students, but also the general population, to reach across color lines whenever there are civil rights violations against any of us as Americans. We all know that right after 9/11, the Japanese American community was one of the first to stand up, and as Jimi said, he participated in a rally, an event right after 9/11 in San Francisco, and I know that in Los Angeles, the Japanese American National Museum organized a really large vigil in front of the museum. But unfortunately, there are constant other types of events like this. And we all saw in August, I think it was August 5th, the terrible shootings at the Oak Creek Gurdwara, the Sikh temple in Wisconsin. And there were a number of vigils that took place around the country. And while there were some diverse faces that attended those vigils, I really hoped for more. And I really hoped that, hopefully there won't be, another one like it, but in the case of Oak Creek, in the case of the Vincent Chin hate crime murder, in the case of events like a Day of Remembrance or Fred Korematsu Day, that the attendees of all of these events become more and more of a rainbow that show the diversity of the country and show the way that we're all impacted when someone is beaten to death in a hate crime, when someone is shot at their place of worship for no other reason than their faith or their skin color. So I just wanted to add that as well.
Thank you. Yes, Steve.
I think the Korematsu case will stay on the books and is an important case legally, because it's used sometimes by both sides still with the proposition that the United States can do anything to wage war successfully. And even though Korematsu's sentence was overturned, still the Korematsu case still stands as a majority saying the government could do what they want in times of war, except for the footnote in it now that says the facts that this case was decided on proved to be unclear or something like that. So there is a footnote, but still the Korematsu case favors a kind of an oppressive government view of things.
Do any of you have questions? You can come up here and use the mic. I think it's on. You can address it to anybody, everybody.
Hi, my name is Tatsuya. I'm an international student from Japan. Hello? Yeah. So I'm a senior student in Palo Alto University of Psychology. So I have a comment and then questions. So the first comment is for Ling. So the reason I'm still like interested in those like war or Japanese American or all those kind of thing is because when I was around 8 or 10, I watched a video clip. I think you were mentioning something about showing something that's like in a condensed short video to the younger generations, and that's why I'm still interested. So I want to say that's great things. I hope you guys will find create some great movie or document for those younger generations. And I have a question for Jimmy-san. So I was always interested in like a Japanese American Issei Nisei when they say they're coming to United States, what did their parents or the siblings say? Like, are you guys leaving us in Japan, or why are you going to United States? Without us, or what was the reaction when Japanese Issei say, "I'm moving to United States"?
So Jimmy, did you hear that? So he's asking you, when the Japanese Americans came to the U.S.
He's talking about Isseis, what their families thought when they left Japan. They're questioning, why would an Issei come to America? What did their Japanese families think when Isseis first came to America 100 years ago?
Why? Is he asking why my parents came from Japan?
How did your family? How did their family react? Like their parents, like
when they came here.
The ones back in Japan. How did they feel when their son went to the United States as an immigrant?
You mean after the war?
I think he was referring to originally that would be before the war, when Japanese Americans first came here. Your parents came here, and what did their families think of all this? If there were family left in Japan.
I'm still confused.
What did their parents think when your parents came to America? So the people in Japan, what did they think of?
Well, at the time, Japan was in a real bad depression. And then the farm people couldn't make a living on the farm. Besides that, they had a so-called system where the oldest son gets everything, the rest of the siblings get nothing. So they broke away, majority of them. But like my dad, he came here 1907. My grandfather came here 1889. Wow. And he landed in the east side of the Berryessa area. And he stayed there for quite a while. But they all was going to make the bucks and go home because they heard that there was gold out there, just pick it off the ground type of deal. But they didn't find out it was that good. But the majority of them now was thinking, well, we'll make a fast buck and leave. But they didn't, after they came here, they felt so comfortable. It was tough. It was real tough for them. They were the farm laborers doing hard work, labor work, because the Chinese population that they came earlier, Chinese and Hindu was in the farm work too. But they were not able to bring the wives with them. There was the women folks come with them. So they were all bachelors, were Japanese. When they first came over, they were making negotiation with the Japanese government to bring me here. The Japanese government says, you have to have the wives go with them. They're all human. Because if you remember the time in the history there, Japan, early 1900, was a world power in the Navy because they sunk the Russian fleet in Vladivostok, right? So there was somebody to contend with. So the American government said, we give a gentleman's agreement. We have the alien land law, where the 1924 be the cutoff date. No more immigrants. So that's how they came over, and that's how they were to have family. So the Japanese started having family real early, where Chinese had no chance. They had a hard time getting started. And Hindu people too. So they did very well. Here in Santa Clara Valley, they were the most, I'll say, understanding people here. Where other areas there, they were in competition, like in Salinas, they were the competition with raising lettuce and so forth. In the valley, fruit farmers and so forth. But like in this Santa Clara Valley, there were only about 4,000 before the war here in Santa Clara Valley, and we produced over 65% of all the vegetables that went to San Francisco market, as well as the flower business in the northern part of the county. We sent about 65%. So we had a huge cash crop that would help pay for the taxes. And we helped the economy of the county. And so they were very happy, and they would give us a prime piece of land to farm with. Other areas, they got the worst land you could think of because they're in competition. Because we were in the competition raising vegetables, what I call the fruit vegetable, cucumber, squash, tomato, and such, where the Italian farmers mostly go what they call one-shot farmer, carrots and turnips, and pull out of the ground, wash it, send it to the market. That's it. Well, we were taking care of the other types. So it was a very compatible atmosphere, and the Santa Clara Valley was on the first place the Japanese immigrants able to come here and start farming. How they started early in the 1900s, before the packing house in Santa Clara, A.J. Block Company, when needed Japanese to run the farm and pack the fruits for them. And in the meantime, the fellows came here. We were all bachelors. They had nothing to do one at a time. So they said, well, here's a piece of land. Why don't you just plant what you can do to survive? And hey, this is great, man. The vegetables grow like pretty good. So they expanded. They quit the job and they're farming vegetables. So being that's where the Indian land law came into effect, that they could not farm, they could not lease. Only they ended up with 3 years lease on land. After the end of 3 years, you had to leave. I mean, that's a pretty tough business by the time you get started. But here in Santa Clara Valley, everything done with shake of the hand. Now, shake of the hand. Now, that's it. You can farm 15 acres here. That's like my dad had 15 acres of farmland, shake of the hand, and everything goes under the Caucasian name. His name was Charles Brandt, number 7. So everything goes to him. The market on the Charles Brandt number 7. And all the checks come back, Brandt number 7. He collects the check, then gives the residue to you. Type of deal, and that's how a lot of the farmers got started here. And eventually the Niseis came along, then they were citizens, so they used their name, but it was very compatible. To talk about like FBI come picking up the East States. In City of San Jose, only one person was picked up. Like San Francisco, there must have been 100 of them picked up the day after the war started. So you see that we were working together with the local people and the non-Japanese Caucasian people, were very compatible. Sure, there was strong discrimination. There's very strong discrimination. But we were to circumvent that and not to use that as an issue. We do our job, you do your job type of deal. So it was a very workable situation.
Tom and panel, I've got a question in regard to, a couple of you have alluded that the interpretation of the laws were different in different states to begin with, and this was a national issue, I guess, when obviously Pearl Harbor was attacked, but it was the West Coast states that made the decision. So I've got a kind of a two-part question. One was, were there any other states that objected to the way the West Coast handled the issue, or was it federal, I guess, that handled it? I'm not sure about that historically. And then currently, is this mainly going to be, we have to do community involvement by a statewide basis? If that's what happened in the past, should we be aware that probably we'll have a state-by-state type of issue to deal with this minority infringement, or do you think it's more of a national issue now as opposed to what it was then?
Wow, that's a big question.
Yeah.
So I'll just start by saying that it was a federal issue because the executive order, of course, was put out by the United States government through the president, and it was enforced on a federal level. But I think you might be alluding to that there were some differences in how local communities, and even on state level, people dealt with this issue. And even Jimi was referring to that. Like the FBI picked up a lot of Japanese Americans right after Pearl Harbor, And some areas they picked up more, like Jimi was saying. I didn't really even know that about this area. And that had something to do with how people work together. And the same thing in Hawaii. Even though Hawaii was the place attacked, it was a territory of the United States, even though it was the country, the area attacked by Japan, they did not have a massive roundup of Japanese Americans in Hawaii. And there's a whole lot of reasons why that happened. But do any of you want to respond?
I have a short comment. I'm not the academic, so I'm not a scholar on the incarceration by any means. But what this made me think of initially is we just wrapped up a project with our intern team at the office, and what we set out to do is that in our teaching guide we have a map of all of the internment. Well, I hesitate to call them camps because camp just conjures up images of good times, right? And I think for those who are familiar with this part of history, they know that there were 10 major camps. We mentioned some of them here, from Tule Lake to Topaz to Minidoka and whatnot. But I think what is known by very few is that it was a much more complicated web of Department of Justice detention centers, of War Relocation Authority camps, of I can't remember all the different classifications. But by the end of the project, we're at by our count, we have over 100 facilities that were used to detain and incarcerate a combination of Japanese Americans, German Americans, and Italian Americans who were affected as well, but not to any extent on the same scale. In addition to Japanese from Latin American countries, I think it was 19 Latin American countries who were brought into this country as kind of a barter system for hostages being held in Asia. So it's a subject that I'm still new to understanding, but I am shocked that I didn't know earlier on that I think at least at this point, by our count, there were 37 states that were home to more than 100 facilities. So it just, I'm just shocked.
Oh, yeah, the only thing I could add is before the internment, all the states had their own rights to discriminate against anybody under the then current Constitution. For instance, there was 13 states that had the miscegenation laws that Asians couldn't marry Caucasians, and 13 states, mainly the West Coast states. So things like marriage and even voting was a state's issue, and each state could have their own regulations about voting, and each county, in fact, had their own regulations of voting. So some Asians could vote in some counties in California, and others were rejected in other places. I think still it goes back to what Jimi says is public community supporting and integrating with the public officials and the public in general, because like when after Pearl Harbor, the thought came up to incarcerate Italian Americans, what Mayor LaGuardia of New York said was, if you incarcerate all our Italian Americans, we'll shut down the city. And that's what he said. And they chose not to do it, and they did it very selectively. But the thought came up to incarcerate Italian Americans. And I guess the biggest showing was when at the Dice hearing, someone said, you're putting Joe DiMaggio's parents in camp if you do this. And that was one of the main points that one of the speakers had against not incarcerating Italian Americans in general.
Jimi?
I think that he's talking about the Italian Americans there in California, well, in this area here, Bank of Italy. We old timers know Bank of Italy. Giannini says, I'll back up any Italians that are conforming citizens. A lot more not naturalized, but he says, I'll back up any Italian here. So when you make a statement like that, Giannini, he owns California at the time, right? So, they had the power to do what they want to do because they had the political pressure put on them.
Are there any other questions anybody has? All right.
I do have a question for the panel. First, I would like to say that if you want to learn more about some of the items that have come up, some of the topics that have come up, the Japanese American Museum of San Jose has some really great resources and some really great displays. that really kind of illustrate this in a whole nother light, very educational and informative. So I just wanted to put a plug in for the Japanese American Museum of San Jose. But I'm looking forward, as we move on, just, the results of our most recent presidential election kind of show the changing face of the country. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how, as we move forward, what are some of the lessons specifically that we might want to take forward and use in ways to educate the public, educate school children, to just, reinforce some of the lessons that we've already discussed.
While you're thinking, I'll just start talking. One of the things I notice, and I'm inspired by it, I think that people realize, and years ago, I'll have to say this, when I was a cynical college student, I used to think in terms of, well, these people really aren't talking about the real issues. When I was first learning about the history of the United States and all the things that were wrong with it. And when people say, oh, we should just get along and talk to each other and understand each other, and then we'll have peace. And I said, nah, you guys don't understand anything. But over time, as I've gotten older, I realized there's real power in that. And the thing that I've seen that people do is when they work together on real common projects and issues, even if they don't agree on everything, if they learn how to talk about stuff, it makes a tremendous difference. And so I'll give you one example just from being a Japanese American. Those of you here old enough, you know that when the Iranian embassy, the United States embassy in Iran, was seized in 1970, is that right? 1970s, I think, right? 78? Oh, was it 80? Well, a while back, all right? This is way before 9/11 and all that. There was an uproar in this country, and people wanted to go to war with Iran, right? And people were talking about they didn't know who it was, just anybody who looked Arab into prison camps. And I believe that was even in Congress. Some congressman said that. And what I'm proud to say is there are Japanese Americans, very conservative ones in the Valley, nothing wrong with the Valley, but people I know, my parents' generation, who probably, if the United States went to war with Iran, they would go, sure, we should do it. But that was one thing they were really clear about. When they heard that people, Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, anybody who looked Arab American was getting harassed, they got really, really mad, and they did press conferences spontaneously. They did not need cynical college students like me to go help them organize why they should do it. They just did it. And they said, I don't care what you do, but you may not do that. These people are Americans, and how dare you even question whether they have a right to be here. They're just like me, and over my dead body you're going to do that. So what that meant to me is on a very personal level, they could relate to this. They could see how these people are being treated and see a story, their own story, and go, this is not right. I mean, I don't have to be an academic, an attorney, or any of these things to know you just shouldn't treat people that way. Even if it's across political differences or in culture, people can do that if they're allowed to share their experiences and make these connections. So I think I feel optimistic that after the elections, more people can actually face some of these issues rather than being so super polarized and not being able to talk about anything. If that's something is against the Constitution of this country, it's against the Constitution of this country, and you should figure out what to do about it. So now while you've had time to think, you can.
Thank you. I spoke to a group of students recently at UC Santa Cruz, and they were all freshmen, which means that they've only been on campus for a few weeks, really, and they're all kind of bright-eyed and trying to navigate the campus. And if you've been to UC Santa Cruz, it's beautiful, but it's actually a little hard to find your way around. All those trees that we don't have on other campuses kind of get in the way, right? I gave a talk about Asian American civil rights, and one of the students asked me at the end of the talk, do you think you're just being oversensitive about racism? And I thought it was a really interesting question because I think it's very important to understand the perspective of, basically the opposite perspective of what you have. And that's really the only way that you're going to kind of take two steps to get closer to each other, to understand each other, and I think make real progress. So I really appreciated that question. The example that I brought up to address his question was one from just a few months ago. I don't know if any of you eat Pop Chips. And I'm not trying to do a personal slam against this company, but this company, Pop Chips, happens to be headquartered in downtown San Francisco, their spokesperson is a famous actor-comedian named Ashton Kutcher. And Ashton Kutcher filmed a series of advertisements for the chip company, and it's supposed to be kind of a dating service. And so he dresses up as a number of different characters. One is kind of a cowboy character, another one is like a motorcycle guy, and another one is just an Indian man. And Ashton Kutcher literally painted his skin brown. He wore what is apparently Indian clothing. He called himself Raj, and he spoke in an Indian accent for the commercial. And after it came out, there was certainly kind of a buzz that I saw, at least in Facebook, among a number of the people that I knew. But after that, there was nothing. And I was so frustrated that I ended up writing an op-ed piece for CNN, and basically the title of my article just said, "I'm still waiting for Ashton Kutcher to apologize." I think that was literally the title of the article. And I honestly thought that it was going to affect change, that Mr. Kutcher was going to maybe just tweet to his millions of followers, "Sorry, shouldn't have done that." And even just those few words would have taught a lesson to say that in 2012, it's not okay to paint your skin brown and, just pretend to be an Indian man and really mocking this character to sell potato chips. And I really didn't think that in 2012 we would have to tell him this. Unfortunately, nothing happened. He never apologized. And that's not really the point of my story. The point of my story is if you go to that article and you look at all of the comments below, it is nothing but hatred for the topic of my article, for me, for Asians, for Indian Americans, for South Asians in general. I got a number of hate emails. I want to say the one that I remember, probably one of the most colorful emails, told me that I should go back to my country, an Asian country that would never allow for an Asian woman like myself to speak out the way that I did. And so I thought that was an interesting way of addressing the question of, am I just being oversensitive? Because I think when you see hatred kind of in its worst form, it's a reminder to all of us that there are still so many opportunities to educate those who haven't been exposed to, I think, all the wonderful educational opportunities like the one that we have here today, put together by the library and by Tom. So I'll say that.
Thank you. Anything else?
No.
Any other questions? Yeah, if you can use the microphone up here. Go ahead.
Just a comment on what Ms. Ling just said.
Yeah, speak close.
Yeah, I find that, I have the same experience, on a lot of websites, on articles. It always seems to bring out all the bigoted people, the people who comment, right? It always seems to bring out the racists and everyone. And I think, sometimes it's because of the medium of the internet, which allows anonymity, right? So it brings out, on the other hand, you do not find the people who would support you, to go out and make their comments there. They tend to be in the silent majority. So, as it relates to the topic, right? Sometimes when I think of, about the lessons that have been learned, after 9/11, you find that, for example, the U.S. government established Guantanamo so that they can subvert the whole judicial system, so that there's no protections for people who are in there, right? And even when you have a president who's against it, once you've gone down that path, it's very difficult to actually shut it down. He can't do it even though he wants to, right? And even in the case of the president, a more recent thing that's happening is, American citizens who, when there's clear evidence that they have, they're inciting terrorism, they can be assassinated, through drone attacks and things like that, without any, due process or any, judicial system or anything like that. And in this case, the president himself has a hit list. He makes the decision, who can be taken out. So, sometimes I think, have we really learned any lessons at all from, I don't want to be pessimistic, but, sometimes I feel like that. So do you guys have any comment on this?
Well, I'll just start by saying that I'm not bipolar as far as I know, but I do have those feelings where sometimes I feel very depressed about where this country's going. Other times I feel pretty good about it. And so this doesn't really answer your question, because I actually agree with all the things you're saying. That some of the things that are currently happening, I don't think are right at all. They don't make sense in what I understand of the Constitution and how what the purpose is of the founding values of this country. On the other hand, I do realize, as people have told me, and I struggle with this because when I was younger, I thought that was a bunch of baloney when people say this. But they say, well, democracy is a process, and we struggle through it. And I do realize this country is not very old. And before I get mad at people who told me that, because I thought, that's a cop-out, this is wrong, do something now. But now I realize that it is a process. And I try to maintain my hope based on that understanding that there's a lot of bad things that happen. But you can see, especially if you study history, there are things that are good things that have happened, and people have done good things. They just don't get talked about much. And I would agree with you, the way that social media is set up, it tends to really amplify certain people's hate messages, because I think they feel very, is the correct word, empowered, just to go out there. And I think it's a phenomenon that I think people are studying more than on the internet. And it tends to amplify it to the point, I think this is what happened in the elections too. You hear all of this stuff that sounds so awful and so filled with hate, it makes you feel like there's no point in doing anything. So all I'm trying to say, it doesn't answer your question directly, other than that I think there is a lot of things being done by people, and unfortunately they don't get much coverage at all, and they might even be really small things, but they actually make a really big difference to people, and ultimately I think to the country. So,
yeah, I think one comment, I agree with Tom and yourself that there are a lot of missteps by the government, and truly terrible, that affects people's lives immediately in drastic ways. But when you look at history, America moves forward sometimes at a terribly slow rate. Like when you look at civil rights, when you look at the redress issue, truly slow. And even about Guantanamo, we would hope, because of the outrage and even what the president said for the last election before that, is that if something happened again, that wouldn't happen. They wouldn't do exactly the same thing that they did at Guantanamo. So maybe there's a slight lining to that cloud, but I think the history shows that things move slowly, and it's up to everybody to voice your opinions to get the public on that side of it, because the internet is just, my students think that you don't have to know history because you could just pound it in on the typewriter, on the computer, and get it. And I look at it as just going to a library with 10,000 books shouting at you what to do. And except for libraries and museums that kind of look at everything and try to give a balanced view of stuff, that the computer and the internet is misused in a lot of ways. And one has to look beyond that a lot of times for good answers and stuff.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, several.
Okay.
I hope I'm being polite. I don't know your name, miss. You're a reporter?
I guess I'm a former reporter.
And what is your first name?
My first name is Ling.
Ling, okay. For you, I have two questions. One is Oba, and could you tell more about Plessy, the decision?
I actually, I don't think I'm the best person to answer either, but if anyone else on the panel can help me out.
Yeah, Plessy versus Ferguson, that's 1896, where the 1/8 black person was on the train in Louisiana, and someone pointed it out saying, this is a white car, he can't be in it. And then so they stopped and they kicked him off because he was in the white car, and that's Homer Plessy. And then it goes up to the Supreme Court of the United States, and the Supreme Court just says, no, the states have a right to just separate but equal based on race is constitutional. So that's 1896. So racism is constitutional, discrimination is constitutional, as long as they have equal facilities.
Okay, and you're a professor at San Jose State,
yes.
Right? Your first name is Tom?
Steve.
Steve?
Yes.
Okay, and what's your last name? How do you
Doi, D-O-I.
D-O. Yeah. Thank you. Do you write texts?
No.
You don't?
No.
What do you use for your course study?
We use the standard U.S. history, political science and U.S. history course books, as well as Ron Takaki's Strangers from a Different Shore, and readings and films.
And I had some personal questions for the gentleman who was interned.
Oh, Jimmy.
Jimmy,
He has
yeah.
a question
Jimmy
for you.
Yamaichi.
He has a question for you.
What
Yeah.
was it?
Oh,
I have
these
several of
guys.
them.
Okay.
Yeah, explain to her, I can't hear it.
Yeah, we'll help.
Your parents' immigration, what was it like, sir? Here.
Yes, when your parents immigrated, what was it like for them?
It was pretty tough. Yeah, like my father made remark one time. He was when he came here in 1908 or 7. He actually, as a bachelor, worked on the fruit farms, on the different farms. They would travel from Fresno down far south to Hanford, up to Fresno area, Bowles, then come to Santa Clara Valley and work on the valley. But anyway, he's the last about it. Here the Japanese immigrant farm workers with a backpack, with knapsack and pots and pans hanging on them, walking down. And here comes a Hindu walking down with just a pan on the side. And he says, what would you cook with this pan? What you bathe with this pan? And what you use for towel? My turban. And then what you use for blanket? Oh, we just wrap ourselves with the turban and go sleep. Well, meantime, this Japanese small guys, they're got blankets and pots and coffee pots and different things. And that's how they survive, a lot of them. But eventually, they call for their wives, or got wives, and they settle down, and they start farming, and did very, very, very well. I think you ask about that, when the evacuation, before the evacuation came, when the World War, December 7th started, a lot of farmers said, something's going to happen to us. We knew 3 days after the war started that we were going to be shipped out. One of the biggest produce houses west of the Mississippi River in Los Angeles, Consolidated Produce, one of the employees came to us and told us that they're going to buy you out and kick you out of California. Sure enough, February 19th came along. In the meantime, all you farmers better not stop farming. They put scare tactics into us. So they planted all their fields. And you look at the record sheets, right down the line. Now, they forcibly start moving people out in April in California. 84,000, what they call the A zone, everything west, be east of 99 Highway was divided California, was going to be evacuated. But doing so, meantime, they all planted the fields. And they were all evacuated 1 month before crop time. Right down the line. You can start from Marysville down the line, right down Salinas, Santa Clara Valley. Like Santa Clara Valley here, our crop time starts July the 1st. On the last day of May, the valley was cleaned up. They were all gone. And when we left the farm, my dad, you could see dry tears in his eyes as we drove down the road there to see all the crops in the land. He had 21 acres all planted. I mean, who got that, right? I mean, they had it rough. He spent 20 years of his life, and overnight, poof, what you can carry, you go to camp. That's it. No more, no less.
So maybe if I can ask you one more question, because I think we're going over our time here, and they're going to throw us out.
Someone else had a question.
Oh, and then I'll tell you what. Afterwards, we'll be here to answer any questions you have. Maybe one more question. If you wanted to ask a question, we can take.
I had a quick question. Well, it's not too quick, but I'll try to be quick. Just noticed, having retired fairly quickly, coming from the working world, that a lot of individualism seems to be squished these days. A lot of people kowtowing what the boss says, and you alluded to that, Mr. Doi. And what I am sort of gathering from this and from life, my mother is a person very interested in the environment, and she's made some wonderful efforts and gotten some things done. She's not afraid of civil disobedience. I'm wondering, what does this lack of individualism
that I see happening in the working world, and what it took for your wonderful person to be a civil, I'm sorry, I'm not very good with names, to be a civil disobedient person and to fight the government, regardless what your color, what your ethnic background. Where do you see that going for the future? Was my question clear to you?
Yeah, I'm just thinking.
Well, I think there's always a dynamic here, because one thing I'm concerned about is that people tend to promote individualism too much or in the wrong way, and it tends to get misdirected. Buying stuff, or whether you're going to become famous or rich. But on the other hand, I think I know what you're saying. It's like the Korematsu case and other cases like that, or other cases you don't hear about where individuals actually stood up for other people. That was an individual act. So I am concerned about that people are getting mixed messages about what it means to be responsible in this society, that you are an individual, but you also have to take care of other people, and that is your duty as an individual. So it's kind of it's actually not that complicated, but I think it's very easily confused in the situation you're talking about.
We recently put together, we have a very small civil rights film festival that we put together every year, and it takes on a different sub-theme every year. And this year's sub-theme was civil rights and sports, which is an interesting intersection. So we screened a number of films about the lack of infrastructure for professional women's soccer in this country, even though, clearly the world was watching the Gold Cup finals during the Olympics, so there's kind of a natural interest in women playing soccer at, these excellent levels. But then in terms of the market and the infrastructure, it just doesn't exist here. We had a film about a blind soccer player. We also had a film about Tommy Smith and John Carlos, who were San Jose State students who stood on the medal platform in the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City and raised their fists basically to highlight the African-American civil rights issues in this country. And I asked, Tommy Smith was at our panel, and I asked him, we just watched the Olympics in London, where, this is one of the biggest international stages that exists, and yet we didn't really see, certainly no moment like Tommy Smith and John Carlos's moment, but really I didn't see a whole lot of activism, period. And his answer is just that everything's become so commercial. But I think what's interesting about him as an individual and all of the heroes like him is that there was a lot of commercialism, or basically a lot of lucrative endorsements at stake for someone like him. For him at such a young age to make a decision and basically forego any endorsement that he could have had as a gold medal winning American takes something special in him, right? So I think while it's easy to look around today and say, there's not. It's not like the 60s where you have a lot of mainstream protest artists or protest athletes or whatnot. But I think there are smaller, not necessarily smaller, but there are kind of individual and group victories to celebrate as well. I watch the DREAM Act eligible youth coming out of the closet and saying, I'm undocumented and I'm willing to fight, for the larger cause, or seeing gay youth or adults coming out and saying, I'm not going to hide anymore. I'm going to tell my parents. I'm going to tell my neighbors. As everyone gets to know, I think, more diverse people, that kind of mystery behind our differences starts to erode. So that's the way I look at it. I know, we've all said it's easy to feel distraught over all of the terrible things that are going on, but I think there are really wonderful things happening as well.
Okay, I know we've gone over our time here. I think we'll be here to answer any of your questions if you'd like to come up and talk to us. I do want to put a plug in for the Cupertino Library. It does have an exhibit, second floor, is that right? Japanese American Museum helped with, and please go and check it out. It is about Japanese Americans in the area here. And I want to thank the Cupertino Library and the Cupertino Library Foundation, and please come and talk to us if you have any questions. Thank you very much all for coming today.